problem is with Trump, and you have exactly the same thing with Ukraine, by the way, that I think, I mean, to his credit, we can say he wants to solve situations. And that's already something. He wants to do something, which is fine. The problem is that when you do something, you need to have a very clear and exact, a precise picture of the situation. What is at stake, really? And my understanding is that for both Ukraine and Gaza, Trump doesn't have, he has a rough picture of the situation, but not a precise picture of what is at stake for Israel, what is at stake for the Palestinians, same as you have in Ukraine, by the way, because it started to come with a plan, or something that you can call a plan, maybe. The word plan could be put in quotation marks, but anyway, at least an idea, if you want. Apparently, what I've heard, and no, I'm not able to assess that very precisely, but apparently he was reading a document when he made this declaration. He was reading a document that was written by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, meaning that he's probably not very familiar with the nitty-gritty of the issue. He was probably it's just in his mind. Well, there are a lot of question marks with this proposal, because first of all, we don't know exactly what he's aiming at, because sometimes he said he wanted to make Gaza better. We don't know exactly for whom. Is that for the Palestinians or for real estate agents or Israelis? We don't really know. He wanted to buy the area. He wanted to rebuild the area. He wanted to send Palestinians temporarily in Egypt or Jordan. And sometimes it's the word temporarily seemed to disappear. So it's not very clear what he wants. But we see that this idea is not one-to-one implementable, because many factors have been just discarded. It's a simplified picture of the situation. It has somehow a cartoonish understanding of the situation. So a lot of details have disappeared. So the problem with Gaza, with the Palestinians, is not that they don't have a house. I mean, obviously it's a problem for the Palestinians, but that's not the essence. The problem is that they don't have a territory. And it's not that they don't have a territory. It's that they don't have their territory. In addition to that, we could even say that their territory is not even what is in Gaza, but what is outside Gaza. Because most of the inhabitants of Gaza originate from those refugees of 1948, from the Nakba. And these people used to live in the southern part of Israel. They were repelled in this area, which is today called Gaza. But this area didn't exist before. You know, it's a huge refugee camp that was created by the Israelis, essentially. And what adds to the problem is that Israel continues on the same path since 80 years without being sanctioned by the international community, although it was stated on many documents, resolutions. There are almost 100 resolutions of the United Nations that condemn the action of Israel. And these resolutions do not condemn Israel because they are Jews. They condemn Israel because Israel is not behaving according to the international law, and took over territories illegally. As I said, the starting point of all that is, of course, Resolution 181 of 29th of November 1947. And if you read this document, you would say that, in fact, Israel could build, I mean, you could have those two countries, an Arab state and a Jewish state, but based on referendum, based on consultation of population. And to avoid that, Israel just took over the territory. And it took over not after 1948, but before 1948, between November 1947 to May 1948. And even if you read the memories or the memoir of Ben Gurion, David Ben Gurion, he said that in May 1948, they had even taken more territory than the territory that was proposed in this possible partition plan that was annexed to the resolution of 1948 or 47. So here is the problem. Of course, they would like to have a better life, that's for sure, and they would certainly welcome to have nice buildings and a nice flat screen TVs and all that, no doubt. But this is not the essence. The essence is that they were expelled from their own homes and villages 80 years ago, and now they took refuge in this area, and now they are expelled again from this area. And just pushing the Palestinians outside of Palestine, in fact, is simply not the solution of the problem. And I think this is very strange, because I mean, it's strange in a sense. On the other hand, it's not very surprising, because US has consistently followed blindly what Israel was saying, and for that reason, this is not really a surprise to see that. But it is strange to acknowledge or observe that the Americans have not yet understood the very nature of the problem. Because regardless of how you feel about Israelis or Palestinians, such a solution as the one that was proposed by Trump cannot bring the solution. Simply cannot. And all the nations, I mean, the nations that are and countries that are around Israel have understood that perfectly. And that's the reason why even last year, Antony Blinken tried to ask the same question, both to the Egyptian and the Jordanian governments, to take these Palestinians. And Egyptians refused. I mean, Egyptians and Jordanians refused. Interestingly enough, this was taken by Western propaganda as the fact that, you see, even the Arabs don't want Palestinians. The Arabs don't even want to help their brothers. But it's not the question. And here, the reason why Egypt doesn't want to have the Palestinian on the territory is that there are many reasons. Even though that I remind you that in order to be member of the United Nations in 1949, the Israelis, or the Israeli government, pledged to abide by the international law and UN resolutions, including the right of return for the Palestinians. And that was a condition for Israel to enter, or to get membership for the United Nations. And since then, Israel never complied with its own word. The first one is that by doing so, Egypt would in fact accept, or tacitly accept, this factual problem that Israel is trying to gain territory by expelling Palestinians. So that's the first, because everybody knows, because it has been the case in the past, that if the Palestinians are moved in Palestine or Jordan, they will not come back. They will not be back. Everybody knows that. And the Israelis have consistently applied this policy of no return. So that means that there is not a single square meter of Israel that has been acquired legally by Israel. Everything has been taken by force. So if you're Palestinian today, you see that you are expelled by brutal force from place to place. And in addition to that, the guy who expels you, in fact, is not sanctioned in any way. So how can you see the situation without having some anger? And that's probably what Donald Trump misses in assessing the situation. Now, as to the plan itself, again, it doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the can down the road because, again, the problem is not for the Palestinians to have a place. In fact, there have been several proposals that have been made in the past, even by Saudi Arabia, if I'm not wrong, to have these the refugees, or at least some of them, on their territory. So the problem is not the space. The problem is that you are on the territory, the place where you were born, and you are expelled from that place. And this is a question of justice. This is a question of humanity, and this is a question of international law. And you probably have an additional factor that came to the surface, especially in the last 1 year and a half of the operation in Gaza. It's that it has become absolutely apparent for the whole world that Israel is not abiding by the international law. You know, prior to that, you had Israel bombing Gaza from time to time, but they're saying, "Oh, they are terrorists, so we can bomb them," and everybody was happy, even in the West. Nobody questioned that. Today, the problem is slightly different because it has gained such a dimension that it's no longer possible to ignore the violation, the blatant violation of the international law. In addition to that, Netanyahu has been indicted by the international, and of course you have these proceedings going into the International Court of Justice, meaning that we know today, and it's obvious for everybody, regardless of who you are. I mean, obviously you have people that don't have from bad faith who would not understand that. But let's say for the majority of the population of the world, it's clear that Israel is not respecting the law, the international humanitarian law. And so these are the essential reason for this. And finally, no, there is also something important. That would be contrary to the international law, because you cannot have create permanent refugee camps in some places, and Israel using its neighbors to create permanent refugee camps. So that would be against the international law. The next question would be, who would fund that? So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever for the Egyptians and the Jordanian to accept that. The advantage of the Hamas and Palestinians is that, in essence, they are stronger than the Israelis, and they have the public opinion support that they didn't have before. That's why it's very important to make the shortfalls that I have mentioned before, to make them known to the public, so that people understand that the Palestinians are not simply stopping the exchange of prisoners just for the sake of stopping. They stop because they have a reason for that. And the reason is that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. So we are in a kind of situation. I mean, the Netanyahu has a culture of vengeance, and we have seen that, by the way they behave. For instance, when after the 7th of October, they started to revenge against other Palestinians, namely the West Bank or other places, or they started revenge against the Lebanese and all that. So it's a culture of revenge. It's a culture that extends beyond Israel, by the way. We have to take these threats very seriously. But at the same time, I think we need to make clear that the Hamas so far has always been extremely prudent with its actions, and has always complied with all the agreements that were signed with Israel in the past, even before the 7th of October. It's always the Israelis who broke the agreement. And by the way, I have read today that as of today, Israel has broken 257 times the ceasefire. So there is this idea of provocation by the Israelis. And probably I can even assume that the absence or the lack of humanitarian aid deliveries is part of a plan, because they know that the Palestinians will have to react to that. And therefore, they can use that as a pretext to resume operations. So, and now I think we are exactly in a similar situation. The Israelis retain humanitarian aid they were supposed to deliver to Gaza in order to provoke the Palestinians to now. And then, of course, it's a very tricky game, because how would you react if you were Palestinians? If you identify the game of the Israelis, you would say, okay, we still continue to, we exchange the prisoners and we do as if the situation were normal. But the problem is that the situation, and that will not encourage Israelis to fulfill their obligations, because they never did that before. So you're in a kind of a trap somehow. I mean, I wouldn't exclude that, because in the past they have constantly do that. You know, when we talk about Hamas, we talk about a terrorist group, and when you ask why, how can you define it as terrorist? And the answer is that Hamas shoots rockets on Israel. But nobody asks, why do they shoot rockets? I tried to make this research, and I studied every single major launch of rockets that have been launched by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, because in fact the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was the first group to use missiles or rockets against Israel. In any case, I studied that, and I saw that in every single case, the rockets were launched after Israel broke a ceasefire by bombing people or civilians on the Gaza Strip. Invariably. It's systematic. But nobody says that. As a result, we have this picture of Hamas that randomly shoot at people, by the way, killing very few people. If you read my book on the Al-Aqsa flood, I show statistics of the people killed, and you see that the Palestinians, in fact, kill almost nobody in Israel with those rockets. They just want to react. They just want to show that they don't accept to be fired at without replying. So they reply. It's always a response. It's not a deliberate act of distraction. And that can be documented. First of all, we have to understand that the ceasefire is not simply about exchange of prisoners. And that's very important to understand. There are other aspects to the ceasefire that nobody mentioned, and namely, a very important aspect, especially for the Palestinians, is the return of humanitarian aid. And in the ceasefire agreement, you have some elements to the humanitarian aid to have to be fulfilled by the Israelis. So I think we have to understand that way, because we tend to see the problem just related to exchange of prisoners, but it's broader than this. And the reason why the Hamas decided to freeze the exchange of prisoners is because, on his part, Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. Again, we are back to exactly what we have said many times. Israel refuses to abide by the agreement they signed. And that's exactly what we have now. And now, of course, nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about this shortfall in this humanitarian aid. As a result, what we see in the media is that Hamas will freeze the exchange of prisoners. Therefore, it's their fault. You see? So we always know only one part of the reality. And that's extremely vicious in a certain sense, or perverse, because in fact, we are giving a blank check for Israel to resume military operations against the Palestinians. So that's the first remark. And that's where the media play a very, very bad role in the whole crisis, because they tend to ignore a part of the facts in order to portray the Palestinians as those who fail to abide by international law. They are terrorists after all, and all that, and that creates a situation where, of course, if you see the situation like this, if you discard all the aspects that Israel is not fulfilling its part of the contract. The second remark is that since Israel claims that he wants to destroy Hamas and all that, and what we have seen so far is that Hamas has been reinvigorated by the situation. It has gained popular support across the world. Israel has lost the credibility it had around the world. So what exactly the Americans want to achieve by resuming military operation, or just sending the hell on in Gaza? You know, I'm not exactly sure what is the objective of what Trump said, and what Netanyahu said, by the way. So how would they change today? You know, this is so that's the first reason why both Egyptians and Jordanian don't want to have the Palestinians, because that would be what you call in French a fait accompli. That's a situation that then you have to accept, and that will not change. That's the first reason. The second reason is that, as it happened in the 60s and 70s, I mean, late 60s and early 70s in Lebanon, if you have Palestinians in refugee camps in Egypt or Jordan, they will carry on military operation or raids or commando operations against Israel. And that will not solve the problem again. That's exactly what happened with Lebanon. And that's the reason why you had all these Israeli intervention in South Lebanon. But basically, the Palestinian conflict is not the conflict, it's not a Lebanese conflict. But Lebanon was dragged into that because it had all these refugees. meaning that if you have a similar situation with Jordan and Egypt, that would lead probably to the same consequences. And that's exactly what both the Egyptians and the Jordanians don't want. By the way, this situation, the Palestinians being right on the border of Israel and conducting military operations, cross-border operations, that led Lebanon in a crisis situation because Lebanon itself was dragged into a conflict that was not his conflict. And that's the whole consequence of that is the creation of Hezbollah and all that. So that's the second. The idea that some floated that since Hamas is a Muslim brotherhood and therefore that would create unrest in Egypt because they already had problem with this is bullshit. This is plain lie. The reason is, and that's something I'm just opening a parenthesis here. This narrative that Hamas is a faction of an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood is wrong. And if you look in the region, by the way, Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that you find in the Mashrek area, not in the Maghreb area. That's also important to say, because as you say, it started in Egypt. Hamas splitted from the Muslim Brotherhood because they didn't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood. They have fundamental ideological and I would say doctrinal differences with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's why they split from the Muslim Brotherhood. And you have Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, you had the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, and you have Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey. And in all these places, the name of the organization remains Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. I mean, no, they were expelled by Hafez al-Assad, but anyway, so Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, and so on. So Hamas has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is not. I think the Egyptians do not have any concern about this. They have a concern because they would have a fighting force, a potential fighting force on their territory that would drag them into possible conflict with Israel, and they don't want that. So that's a second reason. Now, is this idea doable? I don't think so. The outrage that appeared in the media around the world after what Trump said, I think is a signal for the US that it's probably not the right way to go. You know, we have to remember, I'm ready to give some credit to Donald Trump because at least he's trying to do something, which is something positive compared to what we have seen before. But at the same time, Trump is not very much appreciated in the world. Not even because with the tariff policy that he's applying, and everybody starts to hate Trump now, but also beyond that. I mean, Trump was not very much. Nobody liked him as he came in his first presidential term, and today it's probably a little bit better because obviously in the United States, the American population wanted a change and wanted someone who could improve a situation that was clearly deteriorated during the Biden mandate. So they wanted to have an improvement, and based on that, we can say that at least in the US, the legitimacy of Donald Trump is definitely improved, and probably around the world also. But at the same time, Trump is still Trump. You know, he makes declaration, and I'm not sure that what he says is always well thought. He's kind of a hip shooter, you know, and that makes him kind of a that let's say he doesn't have a huge of credibility because of that. And Trump is starting to understand also. I made the comparison with the Ukrainian issue, and I think on both theaters, uh, Trump and his team starts to understand that situations are a little bit more complex than what they figured out before, and therefore they need to deepen a little bit I mean, make a little bit more homework to come up with practicable solutions to solve the problem. And for that reason, when it comes up with project or ideas such as the one he proposed for Gaza, I think it's not credible for most people. And I think he understands that. And for me, this plan is probably something that will remain in the air, because obviously Netanyahu has understood that this is an option that would fit perfectly in his views. So we can admit that Netanyahu will continue with this idea, but I'm not sure the Americans will. Again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is leading nowhere. And we need to see. You remember, for Ukraine, he wanted to stop the conflict within 24 hours, and then it was like 100 days, and now everybody understands that it's probably not even 100 days. Anyway, so what I mean is that the Trump team needs to mature, and they're probably brilliant people with good ideas, and at least they are less willing to engage into kind of perpetual permanent wars around the globe and things like this, which is, I think, a positive thing. But to solve the problem, since they engage, I think they still need to do some homework to understand better the situation, to understand better what is at stake for both parties, not just one, and to get out of those thick narrative that we had in the West, to trying to figure out the situations with very simplistic views, that you have the bad Hamas and the bad Russians and the good Ukrainians and the good Israelis and all that. And we see that all that is collapsing, because this narrative is not in tune with reality. And therefore, there is a lot of work to be done by the Trump administration to get on the top of that. And therefore, I think Trump is a little bit too optimistic when he thinks that he has still a lot of leverage. They still have some leverage. It's not that they don't have any, but they might be. Now you have Iran and Saudi Arabia that basically have good relations. Iran has received the fighters from Russia. At the end of the day, probably fighters, I mean, those aircraft coming from China or from Russia are probably more reliable, less expensive, and probably less subjected to political variation and decision that you have in Washington. So, this leverage is reducing at very high speed. And again, I don't know. And again, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no leverage from that Trump can use. But I would say that people don't trust him. All the declaration he made about Gaza, that doesn't engage countries to consider Trump as a credible partner. That's my personal view. And therefore, If you have a weapon like the F-35, for instance, you'd better to be an ally of the US, because otherwise they can just prevent you to use your own aircraft. I remember when I was in NATO, I met a guy who was a test pilot for it was a Dutch test pilot of the F-35, and he told us, he said, well, if the US wants us to stop using the aircraft, they were just to turn a button and that's it. You cannot use them. So meaning that when you know that, and the same applies to Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, and all that, when you buy your weapons in the US, what is the guarantee you have that you can use these weapons in case of a conflict against Israel, for instance? And I'm not even talking about the quality of technology, which today, when it comes to armaments, probably today is probably not in every respect, but in many respects, the balance of quality in terms of armaments is probably in favor of Russia, probably China as well. And therefore, I think Trump is a little bit too optimistic when he thinks that he has still a lot of leverage. They still have some leverage. It's not that they don't have any, but they might be. Now you have Iran and Saudi Arabia that basically have good relations. Iran has received the fighters from Russia. At the end of the day, probably fighters, those aircraft coming from China or from Russia are probably more reliable, less expensive, and probably less subjected to political variation and decision that you have in Washington. So, this leverage is reducing at very high speed. And again, I don't know. And again, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no leverage from that Trump can use. But I would say that people don't trust him. All the declaration he made about Gaza, that doesn't engage countries to consider Trump as a credible partner. That's my personal view. And therefore, if you have a weapon like the F-35, for instance, you'd better to be an ally of the US, because otherwise they can just prevent you to use your own aircraft. I remember when I was in NATO, I met a guy who was a test pilot for it was a Dutch test pilot of the F-35, and he told us, he said, well, if the US wants us to stop using the aircraft, they were just to turn a button and that's it. You cannot use them. So meaning that when you know that, and the same applies to Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, and all that, when you buy your weapons in the US, what is the guarantee you have that you can use these weapons in case of a conflict against Israel, for instance? And I'm not even talking about the quality of technology, which today, when it comes to armaments, probably today is probably not in every respect, but in many respects, the balance of quality in terms of armaments is probably in favor of Russia, probably China as well. China is the biggest consumer market in the world and the biggest producer as well. So they will find customers, and they will find also suppliers. So this is not a problem, and all that is a dry loss for the US. because their grain is more expensive than the one you could get in Brazil or somewhere else. And that's exactly what happened with farm products in with China. I mean, as soon as the Americans started to threaten with tariffs and all that, the Chinese said, "Okay, no problem. Do your tariff. We stop trading with you, and we have other partners." But when the Chinese have understood that if they want to improve trade relations with Africa, they have first to develop the infrastructures. And therefore, the first step is to invest in infrastructure in Africa, to create and build railroads, roads, highways, ports, infrastructure to handle the containers and things like this. And then once you have that, then you have create a prerequisite to have a better trade relations, because all infrastructure are ready for that. And the West has never done that, at least not recently. They did that probably in the 19th century. I mean, France, probably Britain to some extent, in Asia a little bit, and so they tried to do so to create some infrastructures to create that in order to improve trade. But since Second World War, the West has not done that anymore. They have probably had to build a factory somewhere, but that's it. They didn't work to improve the road networks or railroads or communication networks and things like this. Um, this is the reason why the Africans appreciate the Chinese, because everything goes step by step, but they move surely into a kind of a win-win situation. You know, it's not just exploitation of a market as the Western powers did. It's also about creating the market first, and then using the market to have trade, and that's you see that with the Chinese. I mean, last year the Chinese have canceled 500,000 tons of wheat from the US. And instead, they buy this in Brazil, in Africa, and somewhere else. So that means that the loss, again, it's a zero-sum game. What you lose on one side, it's a gain for somebody else. As a result, we see this slow shift of let's say influence that goes in the direction of China and Asia at large. We have a different geopolitical situation, and we see that, of course, with the whole issue of tariffs and all that. But we see that the world is more and more split in two parts. The West, and even the West starts to be very divided because of these tariffs and all that. But there's the West and the rest of the world. And all these countries, take Saudi Arabia, for instance, that wants to develop new technologies, new energy solutions, and all that, because they know that sooner or later they will not have oil anymore at one point, probably not very soon, but in any case, they have to prepare for that. Who is the leading power when it comes to new technologies and all that? China. Who is the power that tries or that has the ability or even the willingness sometimes to direct your own economy by preventing export or sanctioning and all that? US. And if you see, for instance, the attempts from Trump to force Saudi Arabia to lower the price of oil, so that that could make some pressure on Russia and all that, he received a flat no. Because today, all these countries, they know that they will have more to gain with the Eurasian bloc, let's say, and mainly China, but not only. But also the USSR with Russia, because Russia is also a provider of commodities and all that. So, meaning that they have an alternative. They don't need to have the United States. This idea that US should prevail all the time because they are simply the best, they have the best scientists, the best economists, the best money, the best whatever, this is a little bit a picture of the past. So the tendency today, what you see across the South, the global South, as we can say it, is that they try to escape the dollar. They try to escape the United States, because the United States are in fact are a destabilizing factor in reality. And everybody tries to escape that, meaning that the leverage that the US has on these Middle East leaders. Just let's talk about the Abraham Accords, or these normalization agreement with Israel and all that. In his first mandate, Donald Trump tried to bring Saudi Arabia and others to normalize their relationship with Israel. And they started to draft agreements. In these agreements, the so-called Abraham Accords or agreements, there was no mention of the Palestinian question. But today, Saudi Arabia has said clearly, if there is no Palestinian state, or if the question is not raised or put as a condition of the treaty, we will not normalize our relationship with Israel. And it's very clear. This is very clear. The fact of the matter is that Russia is in a position of force in Ukraine, doesn't need to have a pause in the conflict. On the contrary, they would prefer to use the current dynamics that you have on a battlefield. And therefore, the idea of freezing the conflict, besides the fact that it's something that the Russians have discarded right away because they have said, well, we don't want to come back in the same situation as the Minsk agreement, in which people decided to go into this agreement for the simple reason that they wanted to rearm and prepare their forces for further action. So, in fact, it was a pause just in order to rearm. It was not in good faith. Therefore, the Russians have said, well, we were fooled once, but we will not get fooled twice. And therefore, there is no way that we will accept a freezing of the situation. They don't need that. They are moving ahead. Therefore, there is no need for them to have a pause. And that's it. I think it's exactly the same thing as what we have said for Palestine, that the Trump team, including Keith Kellogg, who is the special envoy for Ukraine, I think they had a very simplistic understanding of the situation in Ukraine. They didn't understand what is exactly at stake for both Russia and Ukraine. As a result, they came up with a very simplistic view on what can be done and what can be achieved with this idea of freezing. Of course, if you depart from the idea that Russia is suffering from the conflict more than Ukraine, then you would say they will welcome if we have a freeze of the situation on the front line. But the problem is that it's exactly not what the situation is. So that shows that the Trump team came into in office 2 weeks ago with a very simplified understanding of the situation, and now they are discovering that the situation is a bit more complex. And the situation has been even more complex because uh, precisely all the tariffs and all that have triggered response from China. And China has banned the export of some very rare minerals, like the gallium, germanium, there are some others, and even tungsten, I think, has also a ban or restriction on delivering. Meaning that U.S. has understood that by using tariffs and having response from the China in particular, that I'm not sure they even expected that. That's very strange. They thought they would apply tariffs and sanctions without any response, and I think that's exactly we the same problem with Palestine. That I think Trump is overestimating the power of the U.S. and the position of the U.S. in the world. And if you look at who has the most reserves and the most production of tungsten and germanium and things like this, it's China. And U.S. is depending on China for its supply of critical minerals that are used to produce semiconductors, which are considered as critical for the U.S. In any case, what happened is that the U.S. has now a problem with its supply chain when it comes to semiconductor and critical minerals. And that's the reason why Zelensky picked up the problem and said, well, because the whole issue in Ukraine, as we have mentioned on the channel a couple of times, I mean, again, Trump is not a pacifist, but he has understood that funding a war doesn't, but he understood that the war in Ukraine is just a black hole. And therefore, you pour money into that and you have nothing in return. So initially, my understanding, and I think the understanding of Zelensky, is that you are not willing to provide additional support. Well, we give you an incentive, you provide additional support, and we give you access to rare earth and minerals. And for Zelensky, he said, well, that's probably the reason why he doesn't want to provide additional weapons. And therefore, we need to create an incentive for Trump to provide support, both financial and military support. And this incentive was, we'll exchange your support against minerals, access to minerals. But there are two problems. The first is that, again, I don't know what, and again, it's a little bit like Gaza, because Trump changed his mind very quickly. Again, it's a hip shooter. And that's probably how initially Trump understood it. And therefore, this is the whole aspect of this conflict on the Western side. We tend to understand the conflict based on a narrative instead of trying to understanding based on the reality of on the ground. And that's exactly what the Trump team is discovering at this stage. And they are discovering a situation which is very far away from what you can extract from the media and all that. And the fact of the matter is that if you come to the point that you will have to negotiate with the Russians, you have to negotiate based on the reality, not based on a fantasy. And that's exactly where you see the real obstacle to a solution. Although I expected the Trump administration to come up with feasible solutions, probably not in 24 hours, but let's say until the end of the year, for instance. But now I tend to be more pessimistic on that aspect, and I feel that the Keith Kellogg and others are not prepared to understand to bring up solutions that can be acceptable for the Russians. And there is no way you can bypass the acceptance of the Russians, because they are winning on the ground. They are winning on the ground. The reason why Vladimir Putin wants to keep the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, is precisely because of the objective he set at the beginning of the offensive, to protect the population. Because we know that if, let's say, the Russians would withdraw from these republics, you would have revenge action on the local population, on all those who somehow lived with the Russians, or accepted the Russians, or even cooperated with the Russians, and you would return to such a situation where the Ukrainians would revenge. So there is no way the Russians want that, and for that reason, you can just forget the idea that these four regions would be returned to Ukraine at one point. Probably there might be discussions on other territories, but on those ones, you will not have any discussion, because the objective of the operation, the military operation, was to protect the Russian population in Ukraine. And therefore, the only possibility today is to keep them under the full protection of Russia. And there are some aspects that you cannot, when you talk about the return of those oblasts. I mean, today it's no longer so much a theme, but anyway, the idea that you could return those territory to Ukraine in 20 years or something like that, this is a fantasy. And therefore, so that's the reality on the ground. The fact that nobody wanted to acknowledge that the minority, the fact that the West didn't want to acknowledge that, has in fact created a situation where Russia was obliged to intervene. So again, by refusing the reality, by refusing to accept simple real facts on the ground and replacing them by a narrative, we just created a situation that today is in disadvantage for Ukraine. And that will continue that way, because the West has not understood that. And therefore, we continue to live on a narrative rather than on the reality of the ground. So first, before giving access to Trump, you have first to sort out whether you can even access this, legally, by talking to the real owner of that, which is probably you can solve this issue. But there's another issue that you cannot really solve. So what can you give to Trump? So we are in this kind of situation in which, and that's something which is key to understand, I think, the way both Ukrainians and Russians conduct the conflict. For the Ukrainians, Zelensky in particular, the narrative is the key aspect of the conflict. The way it has, everything is in the way he sells the conflict to the West. And we have here a real example of this, the gap you have between the narrative and the reality. And that's where you can ask yourself how realistic and how sane or insane are the leaders, both in Ukraine and in the West at large. Because it's very fine to say, and everybody talks about this kind of exchange, minerals against support or things like this. But does Ukraine have full control over these minerals? And if yes, for how long? But again, Trump doesn't want to get involved in this conflict anymore. And now the narrative of Trump has changed. He said, well, we agree to have the minerals, but not to provide additional support. I think Zelensky, to some extent, has been framed by Trump with that. By giving this proposal, he gave Trump an opportunity to say, oh, okay, I take the minerals, but not for additional thing, but to pay what we have already delivered, which is a radical change. That's the first point. A second point is that when Zelensky said we give access to rare earths and things like this, well, it has to take into account about who owns these minerals. Because in fact, the ground where those minerals are belong to individuals. It's not just land that belongs to God. It belongs to some oligarchs, in particular the oligarchs that is owning Burisma. Burisma is the company in which the son of Joe Biden used to be part of the staff, meaning that these earths, they belong to someone.